welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling something I think most of us have heard about, maybe even wondered ourselves. Does the Bible contradict itself?
It's a really common charge, yeah. And, something you might just hear passed around.
Exactly. So our mission today is kind of like being detectives, right? We're using insights from Wayne Jackson's work to really investigate these claims. Think of it as building a toolkit, a framework for how to look at these apparent inconsistencies.
Right. And the source makes an interesting point right off the bat about who raises these questions. It often falls into two camps, basically.
Okay.
Yeah, you've got people who are genuinely maybe just misinformed, they've heard something and are sincerely asking, and then, others who might have, let's say, different motives, maybe aiming to discredit the text.
That's a fair point. But I like that our focus today isn't so much on the why people ask, but on what the nature of these alleged contradictions. And the source suggests a starting point that feels, pretty reasonable. Treat the Bible like any other historical document initially. Innocent until proven guilty, right?
Mm-hmm. Assume accuracy unless proven otherwise.
Okay, so let's get into it. What actually counts as a real contradiction?
Right.
Because, the source is pretty clear that just because two things are different, that doesn't automatically make them contradictory.
No, absolutely not. This really gets down to a basic principle of logic. The law of contradiction. Yeah. Simply put, Jevon said it like this: nothing can both be and not be. Aristotle gave a bit more detail, something like that the same thing should at the same time both be and not be for the same person, and in the same respect is impossible.
Okay, wow. So it has to be the same thing at the same time in the same way for it to be truly impossible, for it to be a real contradiction.
Precisely. That's the gold standard we're looking for.
So that's like insight number one. It's not just difference, it's impossible opposition at the same moment. The source then gives us some really practical questions, like a checklist to analyze these things.
Yeah, it does. Very helpful. The first big one is, are we actually talking about the same thing or person?
Okay, like what?
Well, the source gives that classic example, comparing the size of Noah's Ark, this huge vessel, with the Ark of the Covenant being carried by priests.
Oh, right. You might think, hold on. How can they carry that ark?
Exactly. But as the source kind of humorously notes, they're slightly different arks. One's a massive boat, the other's a sacred chest. Totally different things, different functions.
So check if you're comparing apples and oranges. That makes sense. The source also mentions faith and works, doesn't it? How that's not necessarily a contradiction.
Right. It explains that when Paul, for instance, talks about salvation by faith apart from works, like works of the Old Testament law done to earn salvation, that's different from, say, James talking about works that demonstrate or are the result of genuine faith. Different kinds of works are in view.
Okay, so insight number 2 is, make sure the subject is truly the same thing, being discussed in the same respect.
Got it.
What's the next question the source raises?
The second key question is about time. Are we looking at the same time period? This clears up a lot of apparent issues.
Ah, okay. Like the example of God saying creation was very good in Genesis 1. But then later in Genesis 6, it says he repented or was grieved he had made man. That sounds like a clash.
It does, until you consider the time gap, like the source points out. Between Genesis 1 and Genesis 6, you have the fall, centuries pass, humanity changes. The context, the situation is completely different. God's assessment changes because the situation changed.
Right. It's not simultaneous feelings about the exact same situation.
Exactly. Another one is Judas. Initially, he's sent out with the others, given power to perform miracles even.
Yeah.
But later, Jesus calls him the son of perdition. That's not a contradiction in who Judas was fundamentally at every single moment, but rather it reflects his choices and his path over time. People change.
Okay, and what about that really specific one, the timing of the crucifixion? Mark says the 3rd hour, John says the 6th hour. That seems pretty black and white.
It looks like a direct conflict, definitely, but the source offers a very common and well-regarded explanation. They were likely using different timekeeping systems. Yeah. Mark was probably using Jewish time, counting from sunrise, so the 3rd hour would be about 9 a.m. John, writing later perhaps for a wider audience including Romans, seems to be using Roman civil time, which counted from midnight. So the 6th hour Roman time would also be 6 a.m. No, wait, 6th hour Roman time. Let me check that. Yes, the source suggests Roman civil time starting at midnight, making the 6th hour 6 a.m., or maybe John used a different Roman method, where they also counted from sunrise, like the Jews, making the 6th hour noon, or perhaps most likely, is John using Roman official time starting at midnight, making the 6th hour Actually 6 a.m., which doesn't quite fit. Let's reread Jackson. Here it is. Some scholars suggest John used Roman time counting from midnight, making the 6th hour 6 a.m., which relates to the trial proceedings starting early. Others suggest both used sunrise reckoning, but 3rd hour, Mark, was the crucifixion process beginning, and 6th hour, John, was when darkness fell or a later significant point. But the most common harmonization, and the one Jackson seems to lean towards here, is that Mark used Jewish time, sunrise start, 3rd hour equals 9 a.m., and John used Roman official time, midnight start, 6th hour, 6 a.m., referring perhaps to the sentencing or final stages before Calvary. Wait, no, let me reread that crucifixion time explanation in the source carefully. Okay, got it. The source clarifies the common view. Mark uses Jewish time, sunrise, as 6 a.m., so 3rd hour, and 9 a.m. for the crucifixion. John uses Roman time, midnight start, so 6th hour, 6 a.m., likely referring to the time Pilate presented Jesus before the crucifixion. The point is, different systems were in use.
Okay, so the difference might be what event they're timing or which system they're using. It's not necessarily the same event being timed by both at the exact same moment using the same clock. Insight number 3. Check the timeline and the timekeeping method.
Exactly. Time matters.
Right. Then the third big question from the source. Is the language being used in the same sense? This is about literal versus figurative language, isn't it?
Absolutely. This is huge. The source uses John the Baptist as a prime example. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus calls him Elijah.
Right, the one who was to come.
But then in John's gospel, when the priests asked John the Baptist directly, "Are you Elijah?" he says, "I am not."
So, contradiction.
Doesn't have to be. The source explains it beautifully. John wasn't literally Elijah reincarnated or something.
Okay.
But he came in the spirit and power of Elijah, as Luke puts it. He fulfilled the role, the spiritual type that Elijah represented. So Jesus uses Elijah figuratively in Matthew, while John denies being the literal person Elijah in John. Different senses of the word.
That makes a lot of sense. Using a name as a title or type versus the literal person. What about Paul? He says he was blameless under the law in Philippians, but then calls himself the chief of sinners in 1 Timothy. That feels pretty opposite.
It does feel jarring, yeah. But again, context and sense. The source clarifies that in Philippians, Paul's talking about his external observance of Jewish law before he became a Christian. His reputation, his standing as a Pharisee. He kept the rules outwardly.
Okay, his resume, so to speak.
Kind of, yeah. But in 1 Timothy, written much later, he's speaking from a place of deep Christian humility and remorse, looking back specifically at his past sin of persecuting Christians. He's talking about his internal state and his past actions from God's perspective, not his social standing under the law.
Different standards of measurement, different time references, different aspects of his life. Got it. So insight number 4, analyze if the language is literal or figurative, and check the context for meaning.
Precisely. Now this flows into another logical point the source raises. The difference between opposites and actual contradictions. Remember the law of contradiction. Nothing can be A and not A at the same time in the same respect. The source uses Judens again. Nothing can have at the same time and at the same place contradictory and inconsistent qualities. Like a door, it's either open or shut right now, not both.
Right. So just because two things are opposites, like hot and cold, doesn't mean they are contradictory unless you're claiming something is both hot and cold simultaneously in the same spot.
Exactly. And the source applies this to God's attributes like love and hate. The Bible clearly says God is love, God loves the world, John 3.16. But other places say God hates certain things, false ways, iniquity, Psalm 119, Psalm 45. Are these contradictory?
Well, following the logic, not if he loves one thing, people, and hates another thing, sin, or loves people in one respect, offering salvation, but hates their actions in another.
You got it. His love is directed towards sinners, wanting their redemption. His hatred is directed towards evil, injustice, sin itself. It's not loving and hating the exact same thing in the exact same way at the exact same instant. See also Romans 11.22, the kindness and severity of God.
Okay, what about that other Paul example in Philippians, where he seems to say he is perfect and also is not perfect, almost in the same breath? That one feels tricky, Philippians 3.
Yeah, verses 12 and 15. Sure. This sound confusing in English. But the source points out, and this is where knowing a bit about the original Greek helps, that Paul uses different words, or at least words with different nuances.
Okay.
In verse 12, when he says he has not already been made perfect, the Greek verb tense implies he hasn't reached the final goal, the ultimate state of resurrection perfection. He's still running the race.
Right, not finished yet.
But then in verse 15, when he says, "Let us therefore, as many as are perfect, be thus minded," he uses a related Greek adjective to teleos. Here, it doesn't mean absolutely flawless, but rather mature, full-grown, spiritually complete for this stage, like being an adult versus a child in faith. The source connects this to uses in 1 Corinthians 14 and Ephesians 4, talking about spiritual maturity.
So it's like saying, I haven't finished the marathon, ultimate perfection, but let all of us who are trained adult runners, spiritually mature, keep pressing on.
That's a great way to put it. Different aspects of perfect, not a contradiction.
Wow, okay. The nuances really matter. This leads nicely into the next major idea from the source: supplementation versus contradiction.
Yes, a really crucial distinction. People often mistake one for the other.
So what's the difference?
A contradiction means you have two statements that are mutually exclusive. If one is true, the other must be false. They cancel each other out.
Like John Doe is married and John Doe is not married. Can't both be true.
Exactly. That's a contradiction. Supplementation, though, is just adding more information. One account gives some details, another gives additional complementary details.
Like John Doe is married, and then someone else adds, and John Doe is a father. The second statement doesn't contradict the first, it just adds to it.
Precisely. The source uses this to address the accounts of healing the blind man or men near Jericho. This is a classic example people bring up.
Right. Matthew mentions 2 blind men, but Mark and Luke only mention 1. So is it 1 or 2? Contradicts.
Well, think about it. Does mentioning one exclude the possibility of there being another?
No, not necessarily. If I say I have a son, that doesn't mean I don't have a daughter too. I just mentioned the son.
Exactly. That's the source's analogy. Mark and Luke focus on one, maybe the more prominent one, like Bartimaeus, whom Mark names. Matthew provides a more complete picture by mentioning both. If Mark or Luke had said Jesus healed only one man, then we'd have a problem with Matthew. But they don't say that.
So it's supplementation. Matthew adds detail. Okay, that makes sense for the number. But what about the location or timing? Matthew and Mark say it happened as Jesus was leaving Jericho. Luke says it was as he was drawing near. That sounds like opposite directions.
That one requires a bit more digging, and the source offers a few possible ways these accounts can be harmonized, meaning shown to not be contradictory.
Okay, like what?
Well, one possibility, though maybe less likely, is that there were separate incidents of healing blind men around Jericho. Jesus did similar miracles multiple times.
Possible, I guess.
Another angle focuses on the Greek word Luke uses, engizo. The scholar Edward Robinson argued, and the source mentions this, that engizo doesn't only mean drawing near to, but can also mean to be near or in the vicinity of. So Luke might just be placing the event near Jericho without specifying the exact direction of travel at that moment.
Okay. That loosens it up a bit. What's the third option?
The third one, which is pretty fascinating, involves the geography and history of Jericho itself.
How so?
At that time, there were actually 2 Jerichos. There was the ancient Old Testament city, which was somewhat diminished, and about a mile or so away, a newer, grander city built by Herod the Great.
Ah, okay. 2 sites.
Exactly. So it's quite plausible the miracle happened as Jesus and the crowd were traveling between the 2 cities. Matthew and Mark could be recording the event as they were departing from the old Jericho, while Luke records it as they were approaching the new Herodian Jericho.
So, leaving one and approaching the other, describing the same event from slightly different geographical reference points along the journey.
Precisely. If that historical context is right, then the accounts fit together perfectly. It's not a contradiction, just different perspectives on the movement between 2 related locations. Insight number 5. Supplementation isn't contradiction, and historical geographical context can often resolve apparent discrepancies.
That Jericho example is really powerful because it shows how digging just a little deeper can completely change how you see an apparent problem. So wrapping these ideas up, the source gives us a kind of summary checklist, doesn't it?
Yes, key principles for evaluating any alleged contradiction. Basically, ask.
1. Are we sure it's the same person or thing?
2. Is it definitely the same time element involved?
3. Is the language being used in the exact same sense, literal, figurative?
4. Could this just be supplementation, one account adding details to another?
And 5. Is there any reasonable way to harmonize the accounts? Because if a plausible harmonization exists, you haven't proven a contradiction.
Exactly. The burden of proof is on the one claiming the contradiction, and if a reasonable explanation fits the facts, the claim fails.
And the source has one more interesting thought. The very fact that the gospel writers, for instance, have these slight variations in their accounts actually argues against collusion.
Right. If they'd all gotten together to cook up a story, you'd expect them to smooth out all the minor differences. The variations suggest independent eyewitness testimony, which historically is often seen as more credible.
While still maintaining the core consistency because, as the source reminds us, the ultimate author is believed to be God, who isn't the author of confusion. 1 Corinthians 14.33, Hebrews 6.18. God is truthful.
So the call to action really is diligent study. When you hit something that seems off, don't just assume contradiction. Dig little. Check the context, the language, the history.
This has been super helpful. It gives you tools, not just answers to specific examples, but tools to think with. The main takeaway seems to be, approach these claims with care, apply logical thinking, check the details, and often you'll find the alleged contradiction just dissolves.
It often does. And that leaves us with a final thought, something maybe to chew on. If even within these ancient texts, these accounts that seem contradictory on the surface can often be harmonized through careful study, looking at context, language, history, well, how might applying that same kind of careful analysis, that same principle of seeking understanding before jumping to conclusions about contradiction, how might that apply to other information you encounter?
Like news reports, or historical debates, or even disagreements in our own lives.
Exactly. What if we paused more often to ask, are we talking about the same thing at the same time? Using words the same way? Is there more information that could supplement this picture? Maybe that approach, born from looking at these ancient texts, has broader value in how we process information and understand our world.
Seeking harmony before declaring discord. That's definitely something to think about.